My name is Jake Miller. Not the most original name, I know, but it's mine. I'm 28 years old, and up until about a week ago, my life had been, well, let's just say it hadn't exactly been the stuff of adventure novels. I'd been bouncing between odd jobs in my small hometown of Havenwood, Ohio, mostly manual labor and the occasional stint helping out at my uncle's hardware store. Nothing glamorous, nothing that set my soul on fire. More like a slow, steady simmer of existential boredom. That was until I saw the ad. Tucked away in the back pages of the local newspaper, almost hidden amongst the classifieds for used tractors and bake sales, was a listing that caught my eye. It was for a seasonal fire lookout position in the Redwood National and State Parks in Northern California. The description was brief, almost cryptic, seeking responsible individual for solitary post atop Redwood Peak. Must be comfortable with heights, isolation, and adherence to strict regulations. Experience preferred but not necessary. Generous stipend provided. Something about it resonated with me. Maybe it was the allure of the towering redwoods I'd only ever seen in pictures, or perhaps it was the promise of solitude, a stark contrast to the familiar faces and routines of Havenwood. Whatever it was, I felt a pull, a sense that this was the escape I hadn't even realized I was craving. The application process was surprisingly straightforward. A phone interview with a gruff-sounding ranger named Ede, a background check that thankfully came back clean despite a few youthful indiscretions involving fireworks, and a neighbor's prize-winning petunias, and then, a week later, a confirmation email landed in my inbox. I was in. I was going to be a fire lookout. The journey from Ohio to Northern California was long, a blur of interstate highways and anonymous motel rooms. But as I finally drove along the winding, redwood-lined roads leading to the park headquarters, a sense of anticipation began to build. The sheer scale of the trees was breathtaking. They seemed to pierce the sky, their ancient, moss-covered trunks whispering tales of centuries past. I felt small, insignificant, yet somehow connected to something vast and enduring. Park headquarters was a modest log cabin nestled amongst the giants. Ranger Ed, the voice from the phone, turned out to be a man of few words and even fewer smiles. He was a stocky figure with a weathered face that spoke of years spent battling wildfires and dealing with overly enthusiastic tourists. He handed me a thick binder labeled Fire Lookout Protocol Redwood Peak and a set of keys. Your supplies are already up at the tower. He grunted, pointing towards a distant peak shrouded in mist. The trail's about 6 miles, steep in parts. Take your time. Check in with dispatch twice a day, morning and evening. Any smoke you reported immediately. Got it. I nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. Got it, Ranger Ed. Good. Now, there are a few specific instructions in that binder, he added, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, a hint of something I couldn't quite place. Pay close attention to them. They're not just suggestions. He gave me a long, hard stare before finally dismissing me with a curt nod. The hike up to Redwood Peak was grueling. The trail switchbacked relentlessly, the air growing thinner with each step. My backpack, filled with personal belongings and a week's worth of groceries I'd picked up in a nearby town, felt heavier than it probably was. But the scenery was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Giant ferns unfurled like prehistoric scrolls, and the air was thick with the earthy scent of damp soil and pine needles. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the summit. Perched precariously on the highest point was the Fire Lookout Tower. It was a simple, 2-story structure made of sturdy timber, with a glass, enclosed observation cab on top offering panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. It looked both sturdy and vulnerable, a tiny outpost against the immensity of nature. I unlocked the heavy wooden door at the base of the tower and stepped inside. The lower level contained a small living space with a cot, a wood-burning stove, a table, and a couple of chairs. It was basic but functional. A narrow wooden staircase led up to the observation cab, which was dominated by a large circular map table and a high-powered telescope mounted in the center. Windows surrounded the entire room, offering an unobstructed 360-degree view. The view was breathtaking. As far as the eye could see, it was a sea of green, the undulating canopy of the redwood forest stretching to the horizon. In the distance, I could glimpse the shimmering ribbon of the Pacific Ocean. It was a view that made you feel both incredibly small and strangely connected to the vastness of the world. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking my things, organizing my supplies, and familiarizing myself with the equipment. The radio crackled occasionally with routine dispatches from other rangers, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. As evening approached, I consulted the Fire Lookout Protocol binder that Ranger Ed had given me. It was filled with standard operating procedures, how to spot and report fires, weather monitoring guidelines, emergency contact information. But then I came across a section titled Specific Regulations for Redwood Peak. This was what Ranger Ed had alluded to. The first few rules were unremarkable. Maintain a clean and organized living space. Conserve water and firewood. Report any unusual wildlife sightings. But as I read further, the rules became increasingly strange and unsettling. Rule high when silence after sunset. Under no circumstances is any loud noise to be made outside the tower after sunset. This includes, but is not limited to, shouting, playing music, operating power tools, or engaging in any activity that could be considered disruptive to the natural soundscape. The reasons for this regulation are sensitive and not for public disclosure. Strict adherence is mandatory. I frowned. Silence after sunset, it seemed a bit extreme. I could understand keeping the noise down out of respect for nature and other potential hikers, but a complete ban, and the cryptic explanation only made it more intriguing and a little unnerving. Rule 8.2v, the north window. The north-facing window in the observation cab is to remain covered at all times between the hours of midnight and 4000 am. The provided heavy blackout curtain must be securely fastened. Do not attempt to look out of this window during these hours, regardless of any sounds or visual phenomena you may perceive. Violations of this regulation will result in immediate termination of employment and potential further consequences. This one sent a shiver down my spine. What could possibly be so important about keeping the north window covered during those specific hours? What kind of visual phenomena were they expecting? The mention of further consequences was particularly unsettling. Rule Way 3, no fires on the ground. No open fires are permitted outside the designated wood, burning stove within the tower at any time. This includes campfires for cooking or any other purpose. All cooking must be done on the propane stove provided. The forest in this area is particularly susceptible to wildfires, and extreme caution is required. This rule seemed reasonable enough, given my job was to prevent wildfires. Still, the emphasis felt a bit intense. Rule 4, the visitor log. Any visitors to the tower, regardless of their appearance or stated purpose, are to be politely but firmly instructed to leave the premises immediately. Do not engage in prolonged conversation or offer assistance beyond providing basic directions back to the trailhead. Document the encounter in the visitor logbook, noting the date, time, number of individuals, and any distinguishing features. Under no circumstances are visitors permitted to remain at the tower overnight. This rule struck me as odd. I was miles from any established trails or campgrounds. Who would be hiking up to a remote fire lookout tower in the middle of the wilderness? And why the need for such a strict and almost wary tone? Rule 5e, the whistle. A standard issue emergency whistle has been provided as part of your equipment. This whistle is to be used on a wire in the event of an actual fire or a serious medical emergency requiring immediate evacuation. Under no circumstances is the whistle to be used for any other purpose, including signaling, communication, or as a deterrent to wildlife. Misuse of the whistle will be considered a severe breach of protocol. Another rule with an unusual level of emphasis. It made me wonder what kind of emergencies they anticipated up here. Rule 6, observation hours. While you are expected to remain vigilant at all times, focused observation for fire detection is to be conducted primarily during daylight hours, from dawn until dusk. While occasional nighttime checks are permissible, prolonged or intense scrutiny of the surrounding forest during the hours of darkness is discouraged. This one was perhaps the most unsettling of all. As a fire lookout, wasn't I supposed to be watching for fires at all times? Why would they discourage nighttime observation? It felt like they were actively telling me not to look for something. I read through the rules again, a growing sense of unease settling in my stomach. These weren't just standard safety protocols. There was something else going on here, something unspoken and potentially sinister. As the last rays of sunlight faded behind the western horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, I made my first evening check in with dispatch. My voice felt a little shaky as I reported my arrival, and the absence of any smoke. Ranger Ed's voice on the other end was brief and businesslike. 10-4. Remember the protocols, Miller. The line went dead. The silence that descended after sunset was profound. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It felt heavy, expectant. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed amplified in the stillness. I found myself constantly listening, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. I made myself a simple dinner on the propane stove, the hiss of the burner a stark contrast to the silence outside. As I ate, I kept glancing at the specific regulations in the binder, my mind racing with questions. What were the sensitive reasons behind the noise ban? What was so dangerous about looking out the north window at night? Who or what might be visiting this remote tower, and why the discouragement of nighttime observation? As darkness deepened, I climbed up to the observation cab. The panoramic view was now a sea of black, punctuated only by the faint glow of distant stars. The wind whispered through the trees, creating an eerie, almost mournful sound. I tried to focus on my duties, scanning the horizon for any sign of smoke, but my thoughts kept returning to the strange rules. Midnight approached, and I remembered Rule Fate 2. The north window. I located the heavy blackout curtain Ranger Ed had mentioned. It was made of a thick, dark material, almost like canvas. With a sense of trepidation, I reached for it and began to fasten it securely across the large north-facing window. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was doing something I wasn't supposed to be doing, that by following this rule, I was somehow inviting something else. Once the curtain was in place, the observation cab felt different, smaller, almost claustrophobic. The darkness outside seemed to press in on the remaining windows. I tried to distract myself by rereading the standard operating procedures, but the unease lingered. The hours between midnight and 1400 AM crawled by. Every creak of the tower, every rustle of leaves outside, made me jump. I kept imagining what might be on the other side of that curtain, what unseen phenomena the regulations were designed to shield me from. My imagination conjured all sorts of terrifying possibilities, strange creatures, unearthly lights, things that went bump in the night in ways that defied explanation. I resisted the urge to peek. Ranger Ed's warning, the mention of further consequences, had been clear. Whatever the reason for that rule, it was serious. As the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, I felt a wave of relief. The forbidden hours were over. As soon as it was 400 AM, I eagerly unfastened the blackout curtain from the north window. I expected to see, well, I didn't know what to expect. Maybe some unusual geological formation, or perhaps just an empty expanse of forest. But what I saw when I pulled back the curtain made my blood run cold. Etched into the glass of the north window, as if someone had drawn it there with a fingertip, was a single, unmistakable symbol. It was a spiral, perfectly formed, with a series of smaller lines radiating outwards from the center. It looked ancient, primal, and utterly out of place. I stared at it, my mind reeling. How had it gotten there? I had been inside the locked tower all night. The window had been covered. There was no way anyone could have reached it from the outside, not without a helicopter. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the glass. The symbol was cold, smooth to the touch. It didn't look like it had been painted or etched with anything tangible. It was as if the pattern had somehow materialized within the glass itself. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my initial shock. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a strange set of rules. Something was wrong here, deeply wrong. I glanced back at the specific regulations, binder lying on the map table. There was no mention of any symbols on the windows, no explanation for what I had just seen. The sun began to rise, casting a golden light across the forest. The birds began to sing their morning chorus. The world outside seemed vibrant and alive, completely oblivious to the unsettling discovery I had made. I felt a desperate urge to call Ranger Ed to tell him what I had found. But then I hesitated. What would I say? That a strange symbol had appeared on the window overnight. Would he believe me? Or would he think I was already losing my mind from the isolation? I decided to keep it to myself for now. I needed to gather more information, to understand what was happening here, before I said anything. I grabbed my binoculars and began to scan the forest in the direction of the north window. I looked for any signs of unusual activity, any trails or clearings I might have missed. But all I saw was the endless expanse of green, the majestic redwoods standing silent and watchful. The spiral symbol on the window seemed to mock me, a silent reminder that I had stumbled into something far beyond the ordinary. My quiet escape into the wilderness had taken a dark and unexpected turn. I was no longer just a fire lookout. I was an unwitting participant in something strange, something that the specific regulations were desperately trying to contain, and I had a sinking feeling that my job was about to become a lot more complicated and a lot more terrifying. The silence of the summit no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a prelude to something unknown, something that was slowly beginning to stir in the shadows of the ancient redwood forest. The discovery of the spiral symbol hung over me like a shroud. Throughout the day, as I diligently scanned the horizon for any sign of smoke, my gaze would inevitably drift back to the north window, to that enigmatic itching in the glass. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just condensation that had formed in a peculiar pattern, but the lines were too precise, too deliberate. And why only on the north window? And why only after the mandated curtain closure? I consulted the visitor logbook. It was a simple notebook, mostly empty. The last entry was from several months prior, noting a pair of hikers who had mistakenly wandered off trail. Nothing about any strange symbols or unexplained occurrences. It reinforced the feeling that whatever was happening was unusual, something outside the realm of standard fire lookout duties. That afternoon, the wind picked up, howling through the towering redwoods like a mournful chorus. The tower creaked and groaned under the strain, and the glass in the observation cab rattled ominously. It was a sound that, under normal circumstances, might have been somewhat comforting, a reminder of the raw power of nature. But today, it felt different, almost like the forest itself was trying to communicate something, to warn me. As the day wore on, I became increasingly jumpy. Every shadow seemed to shift, every distant sound made me flinch. The isolation, which had initially seemed appealing, now felt oppressive. I was alone with my thoughts, my fears, and the unsettling image of that spiral. Evening approached, and with it came the familiar weight of the setting sun. I made my second check-in with dispatch. This time, Ranger Ed's voice sounded even more curt than before. "Anything to report, Miller?" "Negative, Ranger Ed." I replied, my voice perhaps a little too quick, a little too eager. I debated whether to mention the symbol, but the words caught in my throat. I still didn't know what to make of it, and I was worried about sounding like a paranoid rookie. "Good," he said. "Remember the protocols." And then the line went dead again. As darkness fell, the silence returned, heavier and more profound than the night before. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. I made sure all the windows were securely latched, and the door to the tower was bolted. I even dragged a heavy wooden chair in front of the door for added security, a measure that now seemed absurd in retrospect. What was I expecting to keep out? A wildfire, a lost hiker, or something far more sinister? I busied myself with reading, trying to lose myself in the pages of a dog-eared paperback I'd brought with me. But my concentration was shot. My eyes kept darting to the north window, even though the blackout curtain was securely in place. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. Midnight arrived, and the familiar unease settled upon me. I double-checked the blackout curtain, making sure it was fully closed and securely fastened. Then, I sat down at the table, trying to appear calm, trying to ignore the oppressive silence and the nagging feeling of dread. It was then that I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the direction of the north window. It was a soft, almost delicate sound, like fingernails gently scraping against glass. My heart pounded in my chest. I froze, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. The scratching continued, a rhythmic, almost insistent pattern. It seemed to be focused on the area of the window where the spiral symbol had appeared. My mind raced. What could be making that sound? An animal. But what kind of animal could reach a window that high up, and why would it be scratching in that particular spot? The scratching stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was only silence. Then I heard something else. A faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I had imagined it. It seemed to be coming from behind the blackout curtain. I couldn't make out any words, just a low, sibilant murmur that sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was just the wind, playing tricks on my ears. But there was no wind. The night was eerily still. The whisper came again, a little louder this time, and I could almost discern a pattern to it, a cadence that sounded almost like speech. My hand trembled as I reached for the radio. Should I call dispatch? Report what I was hearing. But what would I say? "Ranger Ed, I think there's a ghost whispering at my window." I could practically hear his exasperated sigh over the radio. I decided to hold off, to try and figure out what was going on before I made myself sound completely insane. I stood up slowly, my muscles tense, and took a tentative step towards the north window. The whispering continued, a low, insistent drone that seemed to be seeping through the thick fabric of the curtain. Against my better judgment, against the clear instructions in the protocol, I reached out and slowly, cautiously, pulled back a corner of the blackout curtain. My eyes darted to the glass, expecting to see what? I wasn't sure. The spiral symbol was still there, glowing faintly in the darkness. But now, there was something else. Pressed against the outside of the glass, directly over the spiral, was a pale, almost translucent hand. The fingers were long and slender, unnaturally so, and the knuckles were strangely elongated. It looked like something not quite human. I recoiled in horror, stumbling backward and letting the curtain fall back into place. The whispering stopped. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I pressed myself against the opposite wall, my eyes wide with terror. What had I just seen? A trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. I desperately wanted to believe that, but the image of that pale, skeletal hand pressed against the glass was burned into my mind. For the rest of the night, I sat huddled in the corner of the observation cab, staring at the north window. The silence had returned, but it was no longer empty. It felt thick with a palpable sense of dread, like something was lurking just beyond the veil of darkness, waiting for the opportune moment to make its presence known again. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the tower, every rustle of leaves outside, sent jolts of fear through me. I kept imagining that hand, those long, pale fingers, reaching for me through the glass. As dawn finally broke, casting a pale light across the forest, I felt utterly exhausted and terrified. The spiral symbol on the window seemed to glow brighter in the morning light, a malevolent reminder of the horrors of the night. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. Something was happening here, something that was far beyond the scope of a normal fire lookout job. As soon as I made my morning check in with dispatch, I was going to tell Ranger Ed everything. When the appointed time arrived, I reached for the radio with a trembling hand. I took a deep breath and keyed the microphone. "Dispatch, this is Lookout 5 on Redwood Peak. Do you read?" There was a moment of silence, and then Ranger Ed's voice crackled over the radio. "Go ahead. Lookout 5. What's the situation?" "Ranger Ed." I began, my voice wavering slightly. I think there's something you need to know. Last night, I heard some strange noises coming from the north window. Before I could continue, Ranger Ed cut me off. His voice was sharp, laced with an urgency I hadn't heard before. "Lookout 5, are you experiencing any visual disturbances? Any unusual phenomena?" His words stopped me cold. It was like he already knew. "Why, yes," I stammered. I saw a hand pressed against the north window, and before that, there was scratching and whispering. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear static crackling, but no response from Ranger Ed. "Dispatch, do you read?" I repeated, my anxiety growing with each passing second. Finally, Ranger Ed's voice came back on, but it was different now. It was lower, almost a whisper, and there was a strange resonance to it, as if his voice was coming from somewhere far away. "Miller," he said, and my blood ran cold at the sound of my name on his lips. "You saw the hand?" "Yes," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. It was pale, with long fingers. It didn't look human. Another long silence. I held my breath, waiting for his response. When it finally came, it was not what I expected. "Miller," he said, his voice now sounding strangely distorted, almost mechanical. Did you look away?" "No," I replied, confused. I recoiled, but I saw it clearly. There was a sound on the other end, a soft, almost guttural chuckle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It didn't sound like Ranger Ed. "Miller," the voice said, and now it was definitely not Ranger Ed. It was a deep, rasping voice, like rocks grinding together. "You shouldn't have looked." My blood ran cold. Who is this?" I stammered, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the microphone. The voice chuckled again, a dry, rattling sound. "We have rules for a reason, Miller. Rules that keep things contained." "Contained?" I repeated, my mind racing. "What are you talking about?" "The north window, Miller," the voice hissed. "It's a gateway, and you open the curtains." "You looked." A wave of terror washed over me. I finally understood. The rules weren't there for my safety. They were there to protect something else, something on the other side of that window. And I had just broken the most important rule of all. What do? I pleaded, my voice filled with desperation. "How do I fix this?" The rasping voice on the radio laughed again, a chilling, inhuman sound. "Fix it, Miller." "Oh, you can't fix it now. You've seen. And once you've seen..." The line went dead. The radio crackled with static, but there was no further response. I tried calling back, desperately keying the microphone and calling for Ranger Ed, for anyone, but there was only silence. I was alone, truly alone, with the terrifying realization of what I had done. I looked back at the north window, at the spiral symbol etched in the glass. It no longer seemed like a mysterious anomaly. It felt like a warning, a seal that I had foolishly broken. And on the other side, something was now aware of me, something that the darkness had been hiding. The whispers in the wind had become a terrifying reality. The dead air crackling from the radio was more terrifying than any scream. The distorted voice, the chilling laughter, the cryptic warning, it all echoed in my mind, a horrifying symphony of dread. I was utterly alone, miles from civilization, with the chilling certainty that I had unleashed something terrible by breaking one of the tower's strange rules. Panic clawed at my throat, but I fought it down. I needed to think, to assess the situation. The voice on the radio had mentioned a gateway, and the need to keep things contained. The north window, the spiral symbol, the pale hand, it all pointed to something supernatural, something that the rules were designed to keep at bay. And I, in my ignorance, had inadvertently weakened those defenses. I looked around the observation cab, my eyes darting nervously from window to window. The morning light, which had offered a brief respite, now felt thin and inadequate against the oppressive fear that had taken root. The specific regulations binder lay open on the table, a testament to my failure to heed its warnings. The rules, once merely puzzling, now felt like desperate measures against an unseen threat. My gaze fell upon Rule Fei Fui. Any visitors to the tower, regardless of their appearance or stated purpose, are to be politely but firmly instructed to leave the premises immediately. The voice on the radio hadn't exactly stated their purpose, but the pale hand certainly qualified as unusual in appearance. I had failed to instruct it to leave. In fact, I had actively peered at it, granting it some kind of acknowledgement. Rule Phase 6 flashed in my mind. While occasional nighttime checks are permissible, prolonged or intense scrutiny of the surrounding forest during the hours of darkness is discouraged. I had done far more than a casual check. I had been drawn to the north window, compelled to look, and that curiosity had apparently opened a door, or rather, peeled back a curtain that should have remained closed. The implications were terrifying. Whatever was on the other side of that north window was now aware of me, and the rules that were supposed to protect me were clearly not enough anymore. The voice on the radio, the chilling laughter, it felt like I had just alerted a predator to my presence. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and wait for whatever that thing was to manifest itself. I needed to find a way to contact help, to get out of this isolated tower. I grabbed the radio again, my hand shaking. I tried every frequency, every channel, but all I got was static. It was as if the tower had been completely cut off from the outside world. My heart sank. Was this intentional? Had the entity on the other side somehow severed my connection? Or was it just a coincidence, a cruel twist of fate? Desperation began to set in. I scanned the observation cab, looking for anything that could be used as a weapon, anything that could offer some semblance of defense. There was a heavy-duty flashlight, a pair of binoculars, a first aid kit, nothing that seemed particularly effective against a potentially supernatural foe. My eyes fell upon the fire axe mounted on the wall near the staircase. It was heavy with a sharp blade. It was designed for clearing brush and creating fire breaks, but in my current situation, it felt like the only thing I had that could offer any real protection. I took it down from the wall, the weight of it feeling strangely reassuring in my trembling hands. I decided to barricade the lower level of the tower. It was the only part of the structure with a solid wooden door. The observation cab was mostly glass, offering little in the way of defense. I dragged the table and chairs against the door, creating a makeshift barrier. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As I worked, I kept glancing nervously at the staircase leading up to the observation cab. The thought of that hand, that pale skeletal hand, reaching down from the darkness above filled me with dread. Once the lower level was as secure as I could make it, I retreated back up to the observation cab. I needed to keep watch, to try and understand what was happening. I peered cautiously out of the south-facing window, scanning the surrounding forest. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. The redwoods stood tall and majestic, their ancient branches swaying gently in the breeze. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, but I knew better. The normalcy outside was a deceptive facade, a thin veil over the terror that lurked just out of sight. The real threat wasn't out in the forest, it was somehow connected to the tower itself, to that accursed north window. I kept the fire axe close by, leaning it against the wall within easy reach. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but the fear in my heart only intensified. I felt like a trapped animal, waiting for the hunter to make its move. Around midday, I started hearing noises again. This time, they weren't coming from the north window. They seemed to be coming from outside the tower, from the surrounding forest. It started as a faint rustling in the leaves, like something was moving through the underbrush. But then it grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like footsteps. My blood ran cold. Rule 84 explicitly stated that visitors were to be instructed to leave immediately. But these footsteps didn't sound like those of a normal hiker. They were too deliberate, too heavy, and they seemed to be circling the tower as if something was trying to find a way in. I peered out of each window in turn, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. But the dense foliage and the shadows cast by the towering redwoods made it impossible to see anything clearly. The footsteps continued their relentless circling, each step echoing in the unnerving silence of the forest. Then, the footsteps stopped directly beneath the observation cab. I held my breath, my grip tightening on the handle of the fire axe. I could hear heavy breathing, labored and ragged, as if whatever was out there had been running. A moment later, something slammed against the base of the tower with a loud thud that reverberated through the entire structure. The impact was followed by a series of scraping sounds, as if something was trying to climb the wooden supports of the tower. Terror gripped me. Whatever was out there wasn't just a lost hiker. It was something else, something drawn to the tower, perhaps even drawn to me. I retreated to the center of the observation cab, clutching the fire axe, my eyes darting from window to window. The scraping sounds continued, slowly making their way up the side of the tower. I could hear the wood splintering and cracking under the weight of whatever was climbing. Then, a pale face appeared at the window directly in front of me. It was pressed against the glass, its features distorted and grotesque. The eyes were wide and black, devoid of any discernible pupils. The skin was stretched taut over sharp, angular bones, giving it a skull-like appearance, and the mouth was stretched into a wide, silent scream, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. I recoiled in horror, dropping the fire axe with a loud clatter. The creature at the window tapped its long, skeletal fingers against the glass, its black eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. I scrambled backward, stumbling over the map table, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature began to claw at the window, its long, sharp nails scraping against the glass, leaving deep gouges in its surface. I knew the glass wouldn't hold for long. This thing, whatever it was going to get in, and I would be trapped in this small room with it. Desperate, I looked around for another way out. The only other option was the staircase leading down to the lower level. But the thought of trying to escape past whatever was climbing the tower filled me with dread. The creature at the window continued its relentless assault, the glass groaning under the strain. Cracks began to spiderweb across its surface. I knew I had to make a decision, and fast. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the fire axe again, its weight a small comfort in the face of such unimaginable horror. I wasn't going to go down without a fight. Just as the glass in the window shattered with a deafening crash, the creature lunging halfway through the opening, I made my move. I swung the fire axe with all my might, aiming for its head. The blade connected with a sickening thud. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, unearthly sound that pierced the air. It recoiled, its black eyes widening in what looked like surprise and pain. I didn't hesitate. I swung the axe again and again, fueled by adrenaline and sheer terror. The creature thrashed and clawed, its long fingers reaching for me, but I kept my distance, raining down blow after blow. Finally, with a last shuddering gasp, the creature went limp, its grotesque face hanging halfway through the shattered window. I stood there, panting, the fire axe dripping with some dark, viscous fluid, my body trembling uncontrollably. I had survived for now. But the sound of other heavy footsteps approaching the tower told me that the ordeal was far from over. Whatever that creature was, it hadn't been alone, and they were coming for me. The rules were not enough to keep them away. I was trapped in a nightmare, high atop Redwood Peak, with nowhere left to run. The sound of multiple sets of heavy footsteps echoing around the base of the tower sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. I was breathing heavily, the adrenaline still pumping from the fight with the first creature. I had managed to kill one, but how many more were out there? And what were they? They moved like humans, but their appearance was anything but. I peered through the shattered window, the jagged edges of the broken glass still clinging precariously to the frame. In the dim light filtering through the trees, I could see them, a small group of gaunt, pale figures with the same unsettling features as the one I had just fought. Their black eyes scanned the tower, and they communicated with each other in low, guttural clicks and hisses that made my stomach churn. They began to climb the tower, their movements surprisingly agile despite their emaciated appearance. Some scaled the wooden supports, their long, skeletal fingers finding purchase on the rough, hewn timbers. Others used the shattered remains of the lower windows to gain access to the inside. I knew I couldn't stay in the observation cab. It was a death trap, surrounded by glass, and with only one way down. I had to try and make it to the lower level, to the barricaded door. It was my only chance. Grabbing the fire axe, I made my way to the top of the narrow wooden staircase. The tower shook as the creatures climbed, their weight causing the old structure to groan and sway. I could hear them just below me, their rasping breaths and clicking voices getting closer. Taking a deep breath, I started down the stairs, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, each sound seeming deafening in the tense silence. Just as I reached the halfway point, one of the creatures burst through the floorboards below, its pale face contorted in a silent snarl. It lunged for me, its long fingers reaching out like grasping claws. I reacted instinctively, swinging the fire axe down with all my force. The blade struck the creature in the chest, and it shrieked, its body convulsing violently before falling back through the hole it had created. I didn't stop to admire my handiwork. I continued down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, the sounds of the other creatures closing in above and below. I reached the lower level and quickly moved behind the makeshift barricade I had created earlier. The wooden door was shuddering under the impact of the creatures pounding on it from the outside. I could hear their claws scraping against the wood, trying to find a way in. I knew the barricade wouldn't hold for long. The door was old and weak, and these creatures seemed driven by a terrifying determination. I needed to find another way out, or another way to defend my cell. My eyes scanned the small living space. There was the wood-burning stove, cold and empty, the propane tank for the cooking stove, my backpack with a few meager supplies, nothing that seemed like it could offer any real hope. Then, my gaze fell upon the specific regulations, binder lying on the table. I picked it up, my fingers leafing through the pages almost frantically. Was there anything in here I had missed? Any clue, any instruction that could help me now? I flipped to the section on emergency procedures. It detailed protocols for reporting fires, requesting medical assistance, and dealing with severe weather. But there was nothing about encountering this. As I was about to toss the binder aside in despair, my eyes caught a sentence at the very end of the specific regulations for Redwood Peak section, almost hidden as a postscript. It read, "In extreme circumstances where the integrity of the tower is compromised or personal safety is directly threatened by unforeseen entities, refer to Addendum B, located within the false bottom compartment of the radio transceiver case." My heart leaped. The radio transceiver. I had tried using it earlier, but it had been dead. I hadn't even considered examining the case itself. I frantically rummaged through my backpack and pulled out the portable radio. It was a heavy, metallic device, the kind used for long-range communication. I turned it over in my hands, looking for any sign of a false bottom. After a moment of searching, I found it a small, almost imperceptible seam along the bottom edge of the case. Using the tip of my knife, I carefully pried it open. Inside, nestled in a layer of foam padding, was a single, sealed envelope. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was spidery and faded, as if it were very old. It read, to the occupant of Redwood Peak Lookout, "If you are reading this, it means the primary protocols have failed. The entities have breached the perimeter. Your situation is dire. The spiral symbol on the north window is a ward, a focal point for a resonance frequency that keeps them at bay. When the window is covered during the designated hours, the resonance is amplified, creating a temporary barrier. Your act of uncovering the window during those hours has disrupted this delicate balance. The entities are drawn to life, to warmth, to sound. The silence rule is meant to minimize their attraction. But now that they are aware of you, silence alone will not suffice. There is one final measure, a failsafe that has been employed in the past when all else has failed. It is dangerous and should only be used as a last resort. Within the storage compartment beneath your cot, you will find a small, ceramic jar. This jar contains a substance known as resin of the old ones. It is highly volatile and emits a frequency that is repellent to the entities. To activate it, you must break the jar and expose its contents to the air. The effect will be immediate but short-lived. It will give you a window of opportunity. Your only chance of survival is to reach the primary evacuation point located approximately 3 miles due west of the tower at the base of Widow's Peak. There, you will find a reinforced bunker equipped with a long-range radio and emergency supplies. Do not attempt to fight the entities directly. Their numbers may be greater than you can imagine. Your priority is to escape. May this message find you in time. No signature. My mind raced as I read the note. A ward, a resonance frequency, repellent resin. It all sounded like something out of a horror movie. But looking at the splintering door and hearing the guttural growls outside, I knew I had no other choice. I scrambled over to the cot and lifted the thin mattress. Beneath it, set into the wooden frame, was a small storage compartment. I opened it and found a dusty ceramic jar, no bigger than my fist. It was sealed with a thick layer of wax. The sounds of the creatures outside grew more frantic. They had almost broken through the door. I could see their pale fingers reaching through the widening cracks. I didn't have time to hesitate. I grabbed the jar and smashed it against the edge of the table. The ceramic shattered, releasing a pungent, earthy odor that filled the small room. It smelled ancient, almost primal, like the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves mixed with something else, something metallic and faintly electric. As the scent filled the air, the pounding on the door abruptly stopped. The guttural growls turned into shrieks of pain and confusion. I could hear the creatures scrambling backward, away from the tower. It was working. The resin of the old ones was repelling them. I didn't waste a second. I threw open the barricaded door and peered outside. The pale figures were retreating into the forest, their bodies writhing as if in agony. Grabbing my backpack and the fire axe, I bolted out of the tower and into the dense undergrowth. I didn't dare to look back. I just ran, pushing through the thick vegetation, my lungs burning, the scent of the resin clinging to me like a protective shroud. The journey to Widow's Peak was a desperate scramble through the rugged terrain. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes, and I could still hear the faint, distressed cries of the creatures in the distance, but they didn't follow me too closely, seemingly kept at bay by the lingering effects of the resin. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the base of Widow's Peak. Hidden amongst a cluster of large boulders, I found the reinforced bunker described in the note. It was a small, concrete structure with a heavy steel door. I entered the bunker and sealed the door behind me. Inside, it was small but well equipped. There was a cot, some basic supplies, and a large, powerful-looking radio transceiver. I slumped against the wall, exhausted and trembling, the events of the past few days, and especially the last few hours, washing over me. I had faced unimaginable horrors and somehow survived. I found the operating instructions for the radio, and, with shaking hands, managed to power it on. After a few tense moments of static, I heard a voice on the other end. "Emergency services. State your emergency." Relief washed over me in a massive wave. "This is Jake Miller," I said, my voice hoarse. "I was the fire lookout on Redwood Peak. I need help. There are things out here." The voice on the other end sounded calm but concerned. "Can you describe these things, Mr. Miller?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain what I had seen. How could I possibly make them believe the truth? They're not human," I finally said, my voice barely a whisper. "They're pale, with black eyes and sharp teeth. They attacked the tower." There was a brief silence. "Mr. Miller," the voice said slowly, "we've received unusual reports from that area before. Stay where you are. We're sending a team to your location. It will take some time." I sank onto the cot, the weight of exhaustion and lingering fear pressing down on me. Help was on its way. I had made it. But as I sat there in the silence of the bunker, a chilling thought crept into my mind. The note had mentioned that the effects of the resin were short-lived. How long would it take for the rescue team to arrive? And what would happen if the creatures returned before they did? I looked at the heavy steel door, the only thing separating me from whatever lurked in the darkness outside. It felt strong, but was it strong enough? And then I remembered the spiral symbol on the north window, the ward that I had so carelessly disrupted. Had I truly escaped? Or was this just a temporary reprieve, a brief moment of safety before the ancient horrors of Redwood Peak came for me again? As the wind howled outside, sounding strangely like whispers in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that my ordeal was far from over. The fall of Redwood Peak had just begun.